Margaret Chen had lived in the city her whole life, in a small apartment above a bookstore where she worked. But when the store closed down and the building was sold, she decided it was time for a change. At 52 years old, she'd saved enough to buy a modest townhome in Willow Creek, a quiet suburban community about 30 miles outside the city. The neighborhood looked perfect in the photos. Neat rows of townhomes with small front yards, tree-lined streets, and a community pool she'd probably never use. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. After spending decades renting, the idea of owning her own place felt like a dream. Moving day was exhausting. Margaret didn't have much furniture, just the essentials she'd accumulated over the years. Her daughter helped her move the heavy stuff, and by evening, they'd managed to get everything inside. Before her daughter left, Margaret placed a cheerful welcome mat in front of her door. It had sunflowers on it, bright and happy. It made the plain beige door feel more like home. The next morning, Margaret woke up early like she always did. She'd been practicing this habit for 30 years, ever since she started training in karate at the local dojo near her old apartment. Even now, she spent her mornings going through her routines, moving through forms and exercises in her living room. The carpet wasn't ideal, but it would do until she figured out a better space. To anyone watching through the window, she might have looked like she was doing slow, graceful dance moves. Her body moved with precision, each gesture controlled and purposeful, but Margaret never talked about this part of her life. It was private, personal, just something she did for herself. After her morning practice, she showered and dressed in her usual style, a long flowing skirt, a comfortable cardigan, and her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked exactly like what she was during the day, a librarian. Well, former librarian now. She'd taken early retirement when the bookstore closed, and she was still figuring out what to do with all her free time. Margaret decided to walk around the neighborhood and introduce herself to her new neighbors. She believed in being friendly, in bowing slightly when she met someone new. It was a habit she'd picked up from her karate instructor years ago, a sign of respect. Most people smiled back, waved, said quick hellos. Everyone seemed nice enough if a bit rushed. She was watering the small plants on her doorstep that afternoon when she heard heavy footsteps approaching. A stocky man with a red face and thinning hair was marching toward her townhome with a clipboard in his hand. He wore khaki shorts and a polo shirt that was a size too small, and he had the expression of someone looking for a problem. "Excuse me," he said loudly, not bothering with a greeting. "Are you the new owner of Unit 47? Margaret straightened up and smiled politely. "Yes, I just moved in yesterday. I'm Margaret Chen. Nice to meet you." She started to extend her hand, but the man ignored it, looking down at her doorstep instead. He pointed at her sunflower welcome mat with his pen. "This mat is in violation of HOA Code Section 12, Paragraph B," he announced, making a note on his clipboard. "Welcome mats cannot extend more than 18 inches from the door threshold. Yours is clearly over the limit." Margaret blinked, confused. She looked down at her mat. It was maybe 20 inches wide at most. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize there were specific rules about mats. I can adjust it." "It's all in the HOA handbook," the man said, speaking slowly and loudly as if she might not understand him. "You should have received a copy when you closed on the property. Rules are rules. Everyone has to follow them, or the whole community falls apart." He tore off a pink slip from his clipboard and handed it to her. The paper said "Violation Notice" in bold red letters at the top. Margaret took it, reading through the formal language about non-compliance and potential fines. "I understand," she said quietly, maintaining her gentle smile. "I'll take care of it right away." "I really didn't know." "Well, now you do," the man said. He still hadn't introduced himself. "I'm Derek Hoffman, by the way. I'm on the HOA board. It's my job to make sure everyone follows the rules. Keeps property values up, keeps the neighborhood looking good. I'm sure you understand." The way he said "I'm sure you understand" made it sound like he wasn't sure at all. Like he was talking to a child who needed extra explanation. "Of course," Margaret said, bowing her head slightly. "Thank you for letting me know, Mr. Hoffman." Derek seemed satisfied with her response. He made another note on his clipboard and walked away without saying goodbye, his footsteps heavy on the sidewalk. Margaret stood there for a moment, looking at the violation notice in her hand. Then she looked at her cheerful sunflower mat. It seemed silly to have rules about something so small, but she'd moved here to start fresh, not to cause trouble. She picked up the mat and moved it back a few inches, making sure it was well within the 18-inch limit. Inside her townhome, she taped the violation notice to her refrigerator. It felt strange to have it there, this official document over something so minor, but she shrugged it off. Maybe the HOA was just very particular. Maybe this was normal for suburban life. What Margaret didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Derek Hoffman had spotted what he thought was an easy target, someone quiet and compliant who wouldn't fight back. He'd done this before with other residents he considered weak, but Derek Hoffman had no idea who he was dealing with. He saw a gentle, soft-spoken woman in her 50s who bowed politely and said thank you when corrected. He didn't see the decades of discipline, the countless hours of training, the strength hidden beneath the flowing skirts and cardigans. That evening, Margaret practiced her forms in the living room as usual, her movements sharp and controlled. The encounter with Derek had barely registered as an annoyance. She'd faced much harder challenges in her life. A pushy HOA board member was nothing to worry about. She had no idea how wrong she was. The second violation notice came 3 days later. Margaret was reading on her small patio when Derek appeared again, clipboard in hand, that same determined look on his face. "Mrs. Chen," he called out, not bothering to come closer. "Those wind chimes need to come down. They're creating noise pollution. HOA Code Section 19, Paragraph D. Excessive Noise Ordinance." Margaret looked up at the small set of wind chimes hanging from her patio cover. They were delicate, barely making any sound unless the wind picked up. She'd bought them because they reminded her of the ones at the old dojo where she used to train, soft, peaceful sounds that helped her meditate. "I didn't realize they were too loud," she said, setting down her book. "Has someone complained?" "I'm complaining," Derek said, writing on his clipboard. "I can hear them from my unit. It's disruptive." Margaret knew Derek lived 3 doors down. There was no way he could hear her wind chimes from there, especially with the neighbors' air conditioning units running constantly. But she didn't argue. She simply nodded and took the second pink violation notice from his hand. "I'll take them down today," she said quietly. Derek seemed almost disappointed that she didn't push back. He lingered for a moment like he was hoping for an argument, then walked away. The following week brought a third notice. This time it was about her car. Margaret had parked in her assigned spot, the same way she'd been parking for 2 weeks. But according to Derek, her rear bumper was extending beyond the designated parking boundary by approximately 3 inches. Margaret went outside to check. Her car was parked normally. She measured it herself with a tape measure. The bumper was well within the lines, but Derek stood there, arms crossed, insisting she was in violation. He took photos with his phone from odd angles that made it look worse than it was. "This is a safety issue," he said, his voice getting louder. "Fire lanes need to be clear. What if an emergency vehicle needed to get through?" There was plenty of room for any vehicle to pass. The parking lot was nearly empty, but Margaret moved her car forward anyway, even though it meant parking awkwardly close to the concrete barrier in front of her spot. "Better," Derek said, making a note. "Try to be more careful next time." That evening, Margaret's neighbor from the unit next door knocked on her door. Her name was Patricia, a young mother with a toddler who Margaret had helped once when the little boy's ball rolled into her yard. Patricia looked worried. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," Patricia started, shifting her weight nervously, "but I've been watching how Derek treats you. He's doing the same thing he did to Mrs. Rodriguez before she moved out last year." Margaret invited her in for tea. As they sat at the small kitchen table, Patricia explained that Derek had a pattern. He'd pick someone in the neighborhood, usually someone he thought wouldn't fight back, and make their life miserable with constant violations and complaints. "Mrs. Rodriguez was this sweet elderly lady from Mexico," Patricia said, her hands wrapped around her tea mug. "Derek wrote her up for everything. Her garden, her decorations, the way she parked. She spoke English perfectly fine, but he'd always talk to her like she couldn't understand. Eventually, she just gave up and moved. It broke my heart." Patricia pulled out her phone and showed Margaret photos she'd secretly taken over the past few weeks, pictures of other neighbors with the exact same violations that Derek ignored. Wind chimes on at least 4 other patios. Welcome mats that were clearly oversized. Cars parked. "He only targets certain people," Patricia said carefully. "I think you know what I mean." Margaret did know. She'd experienced this kind of thing before, though usually more subtle. The assumptions people made about her based on how she looked, how she spoke, her last name, She'd learned long ago that getting angry didn't help. Staying calm, being patient, that was how you dealt with small-minded people. "I appreciate you telling me," Margaret said, patting Patricia's hand. "But I can handle Derek. I've dealt with much worse than an over-eager HOA board member." Patricia looked doubtful but nodded. "Just be careful. He's got friends on the board, and he can make things really difficult if he wants to." After Patricia left, Margaret stood in her living room and went through her evening practice. Her body moved through the familiar patterns, each stance and strike executed with precision. She'd been doing this for over 30 years. It centered her, helped her think clearly. Derek was a bully. She'd recognized that from the first day. Bullies operated on intimidation. They picked targets they thought were weak and pushed until those targets either fought back or gave up. Margaret had no intention of doing either. She'd simply follow the rules, document everything, and wait. Bullies always overstepped eventually. The fourth violation came the following week. This time, Derek claimed her garden gnome was an unapproved lawn ornament. It was a small ceramic gnome, maybe 6 inches tall, that her daughter had given her as a housewarming gift. It sat next to her mailbox, barely noticeable. When Derek showed up with the notice, he didn't just hand it to her. He stood close, too close, invading her personal space. His face was red and she could smell coffee on his breath. "You seem to have a problem following simple rules," he said, jabbing his finger near her face but not quite touching her. "Maybe this neighborhood isn't a good fit for you. Maybe you should consider moving somewhere else, somewhere more compatible with your situation." Margaret stood perfectly still, her expression unchanged. She understood exactly what he was implying. She took the violation notice from his hand without stepping back. "I'll remove the gnome," she said softly. "Is there anything else?" Derek seemed frustrated by her calm response. He wanted a reaction, wanted her to get upset or scared. When she didn't, he turned and walked away, muttering something under his breath. That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table and organized all 4 violation notices. She'd taken photos showing that she'd corrected each issue within 24 hours. She'd also started taking her own photos of the neighborhood, documenting similar situations at other homes that never received notices. She wasn't going to move. She wasn't going to fight. She was simply going to be ready. Because people like Derek always made mistakes. They always pushed too far, and when that happened, Margaret would be prepared. In her living room, the space she'd cleared for practice seemed smaller than the old dojo, but it was enough. She moved through her forms one more time before bed, her body remembering every lesson her instructors had taught her over the decades. Patience, discipline, control, and above all, knowing that true strength wasn't about confrontation, it was about staying calm when everything inside you wanted to react. The monthly HOA meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the pool that smelled like chlorine and old carpet. Margaret had never attended one before, but she'd received a notice in her mailbox that all residents were encouraged to come. She decided it might be good to understand how the board operated. About 20 people showed up, mostly older residents and a few younger homeowners who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Derek sat at the front table with 3 other board members, shuffling papers and looking official. When he saw Margaret enter and take a seat in the back row, his expression changed. A small smile crossed his face, the kind that made Margaret's stomach tighten. The meeting started normally enough. Discussion about pool maintenance, approval of new landscaping for the common areas, debate about whether to repave the parking lot. Margaret listened quietly, taking mental notes about how everything worked. Then Derek cleared his throat and pulled out a folder. "Before we adjourn, I need to bring up a concerning issue regarding one of our residents." Margaret knew what was coming. "We have a homeowner in Unit 47 who has received multiple violation notices over the past month," Derek said, his voice carrying across the room. 4 separate violations, to be exact. Each time we've been patient and given warnings, but the pattern of non-compliance is troubling. He didn't say Margaret's name, but everyone turned to look at her anyway. She sat still, her hands folded in her lap. "Now, I understand that some people come from places where rules aren't as important," Derek continued, his tone dripping with false sympathy, "where community standards might be different. But here in Willow Creek, we have certain expectations. We maintain these standards because that's what keeps our property values high and our neighborhood desirable." Patricia, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned around and gave Margaret a concerned look. A few other residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I'm recommending that the board impose a $500 fine for accumulated violations and continued non-compliance, Derek said, looking at the other board members. We need to send a clear message that our rules apply to everyone equally. One of the older board members, a man with white hair and glasses, frowned. Derek, has this resident failed to correct any of the violations after being notified? That's not the point, Derek said quickly. The point is the pattern of behavior. The repeated violations show a lack of respect for our community standards. But did she fix them or not? The man pressed. Derek's face reddened. She did eventually, but then I don't see grounds for a fine, the board member said. Our policy is clear. First-time violations get warnings. Fines only apply if residents refuse to comply after notification. Margaret could see Derek's jaw tighten. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of everyone. May I speak? Margaret asked quietly, raising her hand slightly. Derek looked like he wanted to refuse, but the board president, a woman named Helen with short gray hair, nodded. Of course, please come forward. Margaret walked to the front of the room. She'd brought a folder of her own and she placed it on the table before the board. Inside were printed photos, each labeled with dates and times. I corrected each violation within 24 hours of receiving notice, she said, her voice calm and clear. Here are photos showing compliance for each issue. The welcome mat, measured and positioned correctly. The wind chimes removed. The parking situation adjusted. The garden gnome taken inside. She spread the photos across the table. The board members leaned forward to look. I also took these photos over the past 2 weeks, Margaret continued, pulling out another set of images. This is Unit 12, with a welcome mat that appears to be at least 24 inches wide. This is Unit 31, with wind chimes that are significantly larger than mine were. This is Unit 18, where the car is parked with the bumper extending at least 6 inches past the line. And this is Unit 9, with multiple garden decorations that would qualify as lawn ornaments. The room had gone completely quiet. Margaret pointed to the last photo. This is Unit 22, Mr. Hoffman's residence. With a garden decoration that's substantially larger than my gnome was, Derek shot up from his chair. Those situations are different. Context matters. You can't just, what's different about them? Margaret asked, still speaking in that same quiet, respectful tone. I'm genuinely trying to understand the standards so I can follow them correctly. Helen picked up the photos, examining them closely. The other board members did the same. Patricia, in her seat, had her phone out. Margaret noticed she was recording, though she was trying to be discreet about it. These are good questions, Helen said slowly, looking at Derek. Why weren't violations issued for these situations? I can't monitor every single resident every single day, Derek snapped. I focus on the most obvious violations, the ones that are brought to my attention. Who brought mine to your attention? Margaret asked. Did someone file a complaint? Derek's face was now bright red. I observed them myself during my regular walks through the neighborhood. Your regular walks that take you past my unit multiple times per day? Margaret said. Patricia mentioned you've been by at least twice daily for the past 3 weeks. That seems like more than regular observation. Several residents murmured in agreement. Derek looked around the room, realizing he was losing control of the situation. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising. I don't have to justify doing my job to someone who's been here 5 minutes. Maybe if you spent less time taking pictures and more time actually understanding our community values, we wouldn't be having this conversation. What community values are those? Margaret asked, her voice still quiet but somehow carrying more weight than Derek's shouting. The ones where some residents are held to different standards than others? You know what I mean, Derek said, his voice tight with anger. I really don't, Margaret replied. Could you explain it to me? The room was absolutely silent now. Everyone watching, everyone understanding what Margaret was really asking. Derek realized it too. Realized that anything he said next would only make things. This meeting is adjourned, Helen said suddenly, standing up. Board members, please stay behind. We need to discuss this matter privately. Derek stormed toward the door, but he stopped right next to Margaret's chair. He leaned down close enough that only she and a few nearby people could hear him. You think you're clever, he hissed. You think you've won something here. But I can make your life very difficult in this neighborhood. Very difficult. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Margaret looked up at him, her expression unchanged. I think I have a pretty good idea. Patricia's phone was still recording. So were two other phones that Margaret could see from the corner of her eye. Derek didn't notice. He was too focused on trying to intimidate her, too angry to pay attention to anything else. He straightened up and walked out, his footsteps heavy and angry on the linoleum floor. Margaret sat back down and waited while the board met in the side room. 20 minutes later they emerged. Helen announced that no fine would be issued, and that the board would be reviewing enforcement procedures to ensure fair and consistent application of all HOA rules. Patricia walked Margaret out to the parking lot afterward. "That was amazing," she said. "I've never seen anyone stand up to Derek like that." "I didn't stand up to him," Margaret said softly. "I just asked questions." But as she drove home that night, Margaret's hands were shaking slightly on the steering wheel. Not from fear, but from adrenaline. She'd stayed calm in the moment, but Derek's threats hadn't been idle. She'd seen the rage in his eyes, the way his whole body had tensed when he leaned close to her. She knew men like Derek. When they lost face publicly, they became dangerous, not in a calculated way, but in an emotional, unpredictable way. Back home, Margaret went through her evening practice, her movements sharper than usual, more focused. Her body remembered what her mind sometimes tried to forget. She'd spent 3 decades training for situations she hoped would never come. She had a feeling that hope was about to be tested. 2 days after the HOA meeting, Margaret was at the grocery store. It was a Tuesday afternoon and the store was quiet. She preferred shopping at off-peak hours when the aisles weren't crowded, and she could take her time reading labels and comparing prices. Old habits from decades of living on a librarian's salary. She'd filled her cart with the usual items: fresh vegetables, rice, tea, a few pieces of fish. Simple meals for one person. As she loaded the bags into her trunk in the parking lot, she heard the rumble of a large engine behind her. Derek's pickup truck pulled up right behind her car, blocking her in completely. Her stomach sank. The parking lot was nearly empty. There were dozens of open spaces, but he'd chosen to park directly behind her. The truck door opened and Derek stepped out. He wasn't in his usual polo shirt and khakis. He wore jeans and an old t-shirt, and he looked like he hadn't slept well. His eyes were red-rimmed, his jaw clenched tight. Margaret placed her last grocery bag in the trunk and closed it carefully. She kept her movements calm, deliberate. Her heart was beating faster, but she controlled her breathing the way she'd been taught. When your body wants to panic, slow everything down. "Mr. Hoffman," she said evenly, "could you please move your truck? I need to leave." Derek walked closer, not responding. He stopped about 3 feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. In the empty parking lot with no one else around, he seemed bigger than he had before, more threatening. "You made me look like a fool," he said, his voice low and angry. "In front of the whole neighborhood." "In front of the board. People I've known for years. I just showed them the facts," Margaret said quietly. "I answered their questions honestly." "You embarrassed me," Derek said, taking another step closer. "You came into our neighborhood and made me look bad. Like I'm some kind of racist or something. That's what people are saying now. That's what you made them think." Margaret held her ground, though every instinct told her to step back. Backing up would only encourage him. "I never said anything like that. I only asked why the rules were being applied differently." "You know exactly what you were doing," Derek snapped. His face was getting redder, the veins in his neck standing out. "Acting all innocent and polite, like butter wouldn't melt in your mouth. But you were trying to make me look bad the whole time." "I think you should go home and calm down," Margaret said. "This isn't helping anything." "Don't tell me what to do," Derek said, his voice rising. "You don't belong here. You think you're so smart. You think because you embarrassed me at one meeting that it's over? I can make your life hell. I know people. I have friends on the board, friends in the city. I can make sure you regret ever moving to Willow Creek." He moved closer still, backing Margaret against her car. She could feel the warm metal of the trunk against her back. Derek's face was now less than 2 feet from hers, his finger pointing at her chest but not quite touching her. "Maybe you should think about moving," he said, his voice dropping to something almost threatening in its quietness. "Going back to where you came from, where people like you fit in better." Margaret's voice stayed calm, though her body was tensing in ways that had nothing to do with fear. It was muscle memory, preparation. "Please step back and move your truck." "Or what?" Derek challenged. "What are you going to do about it?" That's when he reached out to grab her arm. His hand came toward her, fingers outstretched, intending to grab her by the wrist or forearm, to physically intimidate her, to make his point with force instead of words. Margaret's body responded before her mind fully registered what was happening. 30 years of training, thousands of hours of practice, all condensed into 3 seconds of precise movement. Her hand came up and intercepted Derek's wrist, not aggressively, but with perfect timing. She applied a basic wrist lock deflection, redirecting his momentum and energy. It wasn't a strike, wasn't an attack. It was pure defensive technique, the kind taught in the first year of training. Derek, who'd been leaning forward with his own aggression, suddenly found his balance completely wrong. His weight was going one direction, his arm was going another, and Margaret had simply moved out of the way. He stumbled forward, his feet tangling together as he tried to compensate for the unexpected shift. There was a moment where he might have caught himself, might have regained his balance, but his anger made him clumsy, his rage making his body rigid instead of flexible. Derek fell. Not hard, not dramatically, but definitely fell. He landed on his hands and knees on the asphalt parking lot, his clipboard skittering away across the pavement. Margaret stood exactly where she'd been, her grocery bag still in one hand. She hadn't moved more than a few inches. She hadn't struck him, hadn't pushed him, hadn't done anything that could be called an attack. She'd simply redirected his energy, and physics had done the rest. For a moment, Derek just knelt there on the ground, shocked. His palms were scraped from catching himself on the rough asphalt. His knee was scuffed through his jeans, but more than that, his ego was shattered. He'd tried to physically intimidate someone, and he'd ended up on the ground while his target hadn't even dropped her groceries. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying the same quiet concern it always did. Derek looked up at her, and the expression on his face was something between rage and humiliation. You attacked me! You assaulted me! I asked you to step back and not touch me," Margaret said calmly. "You reached for me. I moved away. You lost your balance." "Oh, that's not what happened," Derek said, scrambling to his feet. His hands were shaking, whether from adrenaline or anger or both. "You did some kind of martial arts move on me. I'm calling the police. You're going to jail for assault." "Please do call the police," Margaret said. "I'd feel safer with them here." Derek pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen. While he was focused on that, Margaret noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Patricia was standing by her car 2 rows over, her phone pointed in their direction. She'd been there the whole time, recording everything, and she wasn't alone. An older man Margaret recognized from the HOA meeting was standing by his car near the store entrance, also with his phone out. They'd both seen what happened. Derek didn't notice. He was too busy calling 911. His voice loud and agitated as he reported an assault in the grocery store parking lot. He described Margaret as violent and dangerous, said she'd attacked him without provocation. Margaret simply waited by her car, her hands visible, her posture relaxed. She'd done nothing wrong. She knew that. The witnesses knew that. And soon the police would know it too. Inside, though, her heart was racing. Not from the confrontation itself, but from what it meant. She'd spent 30 years learning control, learning discipline, learning how to use force only as an absolute last resort. She'd moved away from a potential threat using the most minimal technique possible, but she'd still used it. After 3 decades of training that had been private, personal, just for herself, she'd finally had to use it in the real world. As Derek paced angrily near his truck, still on the phone with the police, Margaret thought about her old instructor. Master Tanaka had always said that the best fight was the one you never had. The second best was the one where nobody got hurt. She hadn't hurt Derek. His pride was damaged, but his body was fine. She'd done exactly what she'd been trained to do, used exactly to. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder. Margaret took a deep breath and waited. The truth would come out. It always did, eventually. The police arrived within 10 minutes. 2 officers, one younger and one older, both professional and calm. Derek immediately launched into his version of events, talking rapidly about how Margaret had attacked him unprovoked, how she'd used some kind of martial arts on him, how his hands were scraped and his knee was injured. The officers listened patiently, took photos of Derek's minor scrapes, and then turned to Margaret. She explained quietly what had happened, how Derek had blocked her car in, approached her aggressively, made threats, and then reached for her. How she'd simply moved away and he'd lost his balance. "Did you have any training that helped you move the way you did?" the older officer asked. Margaret hesitated for just a moment. "I've studied karate for many years, but I didn't strike him or attack him. I just redirected his hand when he tried to grab me." "She's lying," Derek interrupted. "She attacked me. I want to press charges." "Sir, please let us do our job," the younger officer said firmly. That's when Patricia stepped forward, her phone in her hand. "Officers, I recorded the whole thing. I was in my car right over there." The older man from near the store entrance approached too. "I saw it as well. I have video from a different angle." Derek's face went pale. He'd been so focused on Margaret that he'd never looked around, never noticed the witnesses. The officers reviewed both videos carefully. Margaret could see their expressions change as they watched. The footage showed everything clearly. Derek blocking Margaret's car, approaching aggressively, backing her against the vehicle, reaching for her arm. Then Margaret's subtle movement, Derek stumbling, falling. The videos also captured audio. Derek's threats, his comments about Margaret going back to where she came from, his attempt to physically grab her. The older officer handed the phones back and turned to Derek. "Mr. Hoffman, from what we can see here, you were the aggressor in this situation. You blocked her vehicle, made threatening statements, invaded her personal space, and attempted to make physical contact without her consent. She used minimal defensive action to avoid being grabbed. But she did some kind of martial arts move," Derek sputtered. "She has every right to defend herself from unwanted physical contact," the officer said. "She didn't strike you. She didn't pursue you after you fell. She simply prevented you from grabbing her. That's textbook self-defense." Derek's face was now red for a different reason. "So you're not going to arrest her?" "No, sir. But we are going to suggest that you leave her alone."
"If you continue to harass this woman, you could face charges yourself."
"Do you understand?" Derek looked around at everyone watching him. Patricia, the older man, a few other shoppers who'd gathered at a distance. Margaret still standing calmly by her car. He grabbed his clipboard from the ground, got in his truck, and drove away without another word. The officers took statements from Margaret and both witnesses, gave Margaret a case number for her records, and advised her to apply for a restraining order if Derek continued his behavior. Then they left and Margaret finally got into her car. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. Not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened. She'd lived quietly for so long, kept her training private, never wanted attention or conflict. And now it was all out in the open. Patricia knocked on her window. Margaret rolled it down. "Are you okay?" Patricia asked, genuine concern in her voice. "I think so," Margaret said. "Thank you for recording that. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." "I had a feeling something might happen," Patricia admitted. "Derek's been wound up since the HOA meeting. I've been kinda keeping an eye out when I see his truck around." She paused. "So karate, huh? How long have you been training?" 32 years, Margaret said quietly. Patricia's eyes widened. 32 years? And you never mentioned it? "It's just something I do for myself," Margaret said. "It's personal, private." "Well, I'm glad you knew how to handle yourself," Patricia said. "Listen, there's an emergency HOA board meeting tomorrow night. Helen called it. After what happened today with the videos and everything, I think Derek's in serious trouble." The meeting the next evening was packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood quickly. The videos had been shared with the board members, and Patricia had forwarded them to several other residents. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Helen called the meeting to order and got straight to the point. "We've reviewed video evidence of an incident yesterday involving Derek Hoffman and Margaret Chen. The videos show clear harassment, threatening behavior, and attempted physical contact. This, combined with documented evidence of selective enforcement of HOA rules, has led the board to a decision." She looked directly at Derek, who sat in the front row with his arms crossed. "Derek, you're being removed from the HOA board effective immediately. We're also recommending that residents pursue a restraining order if they feel unsafe." Derek stood up. "You can't do this. I've been on this board for 6 years. I've done more for this community than any of you." "You've bullied residents," Helen said firmly. "We've had 3 other people come forward in the past day with similar stories. Mrs. Rodriguez, who moved out last year. The Kim family, who left 2 years ago. Mr. Patel, who's still here but was too afraid to speak up until now. You've created a hostile environment and we won't tolerate it anymore. Derek looked around the room for support but found none. Even his friends on the board were avoiding eye contact. He grabbed his things and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. After the official business concluded, several residents approached Margaret. They thanked her for standing up to Derek for exposing what had been happening. An older woman named Ruth asked a question that several others had been thinking. Would you consider teaching a self-defense class for the community? A lot of us have felt intimidated over the years, not just by Derek, but in general. It would be nice to know how to handle ourselves. Margaret was surprised. She'd spent 3 decades keeping her training private, and now people were asking her to teach. She thought about it for a moment, remembering why she'd started training in the first place. A long time ago, as a young woman working late nights at the library, she'd felt vulnerable. Karate had given her confidence not because she wanted to fight, but because she knew she could protect herself if necessary. I'd be willing to teach, Margaret said slowly. But I have one condition. The focus has to be on awareness, de-escalation, and confidence. Physical techniques are important, but they're the last resort, not the first response. That sounds perfect, Ruth said. Others nodded in agreement. Over the next few weeks, things changed in Willow Creek. Derek put his townhouse up for sale and moved out within 2 months. The HOA revised its enforcement policies to ensure fair and consistent application of rules. And every Saturday morning, Margaret taught a self-defense class in the community center. The classes were popular. Young mothers, elderly residents, teenagers, people of all ages came to learn. Margaret taught them stances and blocks, but she spent more time teaching them about body language, awareness, and how to de-escalate situations before they became physical. Patricia became a regular student and a good friend. They'd have tea together after classes, talking about everything and nothing. One day, Patricia asked Margaret if she regretted how everything had unfolded. I spent 30 years keeping my training private, Margaret said thoughtfully. Part of me wishes it could have stayed that way. But maybe this is how it was supposed to happen. Maybe all those years of training weren't just for me. She looked out the window at the neighborhood, at the place that had felt so hostile just a few months ago and now felt like home. Her welcome mat was still 2 inches over the approved zone. No one had mentioned it in weeks. My instructor used to say that the highest level of martial arts is never having to use it, Margaret continued. But the second highest is using it to protect yourself and others and knowing when to stop. I think I finally understand what he meant, Patricia smiled. Well, I'm glad you moved here, even if the circumstances were rough. Me too, Margaret said, and she meant it. 3 months later, Margaret stood in front of her Saturday class watching her students practice basic blocks. They were getting better, more confident in their movements. But more importantly, they were standing taller, speaking up more, taking up space in the world without apologizing for it. That, Margaret thought, was the real lesson. Not the techniques or the forms or the self-defense moves, but the quiet confidence that came from knowing you could handle whatever life threw at you. From knowing that true strength wasn't about dominating others or proving yourself. It was about staying calm under pressure, treating others with respect, and standing your ground when necessary. As the class ended and students filed out, Margaret bowed to the empty room the way she'd done for 32 years. Some things didn't need to change. She was home.